Rain pounded the truck's windshield, a deafening roar that swallowed the night, as 17-year-old Noah huddled in the back seat, his breath fogging the glass. Lightning flashed, catching at his father's knuckles, bone white on the wheel, and his mother's face twisted into a mask of silent rage. The old pickup rattled down a winding Midwest road, deep into a forest where no lights dared reach. Then a screech of brakes. His dad, Daniel, spun around, eyes blazing. "Get out," he snarled, voice sharp as a blade. Noah's chest seized. He'd just told him he was gay an hour ago. Before he could speak, a hand cracked across his face, the slap ringing in his ears, and his phone was ripped away, crushed under a boot. His backpack hit the mud outside, and the truck roared off, abandoning him in the storm's grip. Noah was a wiry teen, all knees and elbows, with hazel eyes that flickered with a quiet defiance even then. He'd grown up in a tight-knit Iowa town, in a clapboard house ruled by faith and fear. Daniel, a former Marine with a buzz cut and a temper, demanded obedience. Ruth, his mom, recited scripture like a shield. Jacob, his older brother, strutted as the family's pride, destined for the life they'd mapped out. Noah never fit. He'd sketch trees in the margins of hymnals, dodge their lectures with shy smiles, and bury his secret deep. But that night, over a tense dinner of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he'd cracked. "I'm gay," he'd whispered, hands shaking under the table. The air turned to ice. Daniel's fist slammed down. Ruth clutched her cross necklace. Jacob sneered, "You're joking, right?" It wasn't a joke, and they didn't forgive. Daniel's slap came first, a backhand that sent Noah sprawling. Then the punishment escalated. Ruth grabbed his arm, hissing, "This is a sin we can't bear." Jacob just watched, cold and smug, as Daniel hauled Noah to the truck. They drove into the night, rain slashing the windows, the forest closing in like a cage. When they stopped, Daniel yanked him out by his jacket, the downpour soaking him instantly. "You're no son of mine," he growled, smashing Noah's phone with a deliberate stomp, shards of glass glinting in the mud. Ruth tossed his backpack out, a few clothes, a worn notebook, $10 crumpled inside, and climbed back in. "You're dead to us," she said, her voice flat, final. The truck lurched away, red taillights fading into the black, leaving Noah alone, rain plastering his hair to his skull. He stumbled forward, shouting their names until his voice broke, the sting of the slap pulsing on his cheek. Hours bled by, no cars, no help, just the howl of wind through the pines. By dawn, soaked and shivering, he realized it wasn't just abandonment. Back home, they'd erased him, told the school he'd quit, spread word to cousins he'd died in a wreck, scrubbed his name from their Bible's family tree. At 17, Noah wasn't just left behind, he'd been buried alive, cast out with nothing but a drenched bag and a truth they hated more than him. Ever been cast out for being you? Share below, your voice counts. If Noah's story grips you, hit like, share it, and subscribe to Heart Stories. His fight's just beginning, don't miss it. Noah staggered out of the forest as the first light of dawn crept through the trees, his sneakers caked with mud, his body trembling from the night's relentless rain. The slap from his father still burned on his cheek, a sharp echo of betrayal, but the vast emptiness around him cut deeper. No sound of traffic, no flicker of a house, just the mournful whistle of wind through the pines. His backpack hung limp, the few possessions inside, a soaked hoodie, a crumpled notebook, a single $10 bill, useless against the chill sinking into his bones. At 17, with his phone smashed and his family gone, he stood on a gravel path, staring at the horizon, his stomach growling with a hunger that matched the ache in his chest. He took a step, then another. Driven by a spark of stubbornness, they couldn't drown. The first day tested him beyond breaking. His legs wobbled as he followed the winding path, the rain-soaked clothes chafing his skin, his breath puffing in short, ragged bursts. He'd yelled for help until his voice cracked, but the woods swallowed his cries. Near noon, a logging truck rumbled by. Its driver, soon, a stocky man with a gray beard and a thermos of coffee, slowed to a stop. "You in trouble, kid?" he asked, eyeing Noah's bedraggled state. Noah nodded, too exhausted to speak, and climbed in. The man drove him to a truck stop 30 miles away, a dusty outpost with a diner and a flickering sign. He handed Noah a peanut butter sandwich, the bread soft from sitting too long, and said, "Take care," before pulling off. Noah sat on a bench outside, tearing into the food, the taste barely registering as he watched the world roll by without him. Survival became a harsh master. That night, he slept in a ditch beside the truck stop, the ground littered with gravel and wrappers, the cold biting through his damp jacket until his fingers went numb. He woke to a thin crust of frost on his sleeves, his joints stiff, and hitched a ride with a woman hauling hay to a town 50 miles west. She dropped him at a gas station, her only words a curt, "Good luck." With his $20, he bought a coffee and a stale muffin at the attached diner, sitting in a booth until the manager snapped, "Order or leave." Penniless now, he walked on, heading toward Minneapolis, a city he'd heard was big enough to start over. The road stretched endless, cars speeding past, their drivers glancing at the skinny kid with torn clothes and hollow eyes, then looking away. Weeks turned into a grueling blur. He slept where he could, under an overpass in Nebraska, the hum of traffic his lullaby. In an abandoned shed in South Dakota, the wind rattling the tin roof. He scavenged food from trash bins behind fast food joints, swallowing stale fries and burger scraps, his hands shaking with a mix of hunger and shame. In Minneapolis, he stumbled into a shelter, a low, gray building with cracked windows and the faint smell of bleach. A volunteer with a tired smile gave him a blanket and a cup of lukewarm soup. "You got somewhere to go?" she asked. Noah shook his head, the question a knife in his gut. He stayed a few nights, then found a boarding house, a sagging wreck where $5 a night bought a cot in a room thick with cigarette smoke and the snores of strangers. Work was his lifeline, rough and unforgiving. He started washing dishes at a diner, the hot water scalding his palms, the grease staining his nails. He swept floors at a pawn shop, dodging the owner's curses, and hauled crates at a warehouse, his back screaming after every shift. He saved every dime, hiding them in a sock under his mattress, counting them late at night when the house creaked around him. After shifts, he'd sit on a rickety fire escape, reading library books, biology with faded diagrams, psychology texts with scribbled notes, a novel about a runaway kid who made it. The words kept him sane, a shield against the memories that clawed at him. Daniel's fist, Ruth's cold stare, Jacob's silence. The anger simmered, a fire that warmed him when the cold bit deepest, pushing him to prove he was more than the boy they'd left behind. A glimmer of hope arrived at 18. At the diner, he met Dr. Ellis, a therapist with gray hair and a gentle voice, who came in every Wednesday with a newspaper and a warm smile. "You've got a head on you," Ellis said one day, watching Noah scrub tables. "Ever thought about more?" Noah shrugged. More was a dream his family had stolen. But Ellis left a flyer for a youth program, scholarships for kids abandoned like him. "Give it a shot," he urged. Noah applied at a library computer, expecting rejection. But months later, a letter came. Accepted to a community college, pre-med, full funding. He held it, his breath catching, a lifeline he'd never dared imagine. College became his battleground. He studied late, worked nights at a gas station, aced exams in a haze of exhaustion. The void still echoed, nightmares of rain and forest shadows. But he turned it into purpose, vowing to heal others as he stitched himself back together. At 22, Noah stood taller, a survivor forging a path they'd never see. Noah stood in the quiet lobby of Hope Haven, his hands steady as he adjusted a stack of patient files, the hum of a coffee machine filling the air. At 27, he'd built something solid, a recovery center in Minneapolis, its walls painted a soft blue, its rooms buzzing with the voices of teens he'd pulled from the edge. 10 years had passed since that rain-soaked night in the forest, and the boy who'd been left with nothing was now a doctor, his name stitched in white on a lab coat. Noah Ellis, MD. He'd taken his mentor's last name, a quiet tribute to the man who'd given him a chance, shedding the one his family had stripped away. Outside, snow dusted the city, but inside he'd made a haven, a place where kids like him could breathe again. It started small. After graduating medical school at 25, top of his class despite sleepless nights and diner shifts, Noah had landed a residency at a local hospital. He specialized in psychiatry, drawn to the tangled minds of kids who'd been cast out, queer teens with scars from rejection, battling depression, addiction, despair. He'd sit with them, his voice calm, his hazel eyes steady, asking questions they'd never been asked. What do you need? Who hurt you? He saw himself in their hunched shoulders, their averted gazes, and vowed to be the lifeline he'd once craved. By 26, he'd saved enough to open Hope Haven, a small office at first, just him and a nurse, funded by grants and his own paycheck. The center grew fast. Word spread about the young doctor who didn't judge, who listened when parents wouldn't. Teens came from across the state, a girl kicked out for loving girls, a boy whose dad had burned his clothes rather than accept him. Noah built a team, therapists, social workers, a cook who made soup on cold days. He ran group sessions, his voice cutting through the room with a quiet strength. You're not broken. They were wrong to leave you. Hope Haven expanded into a 2-story building with beds for those with nowhere to sleep, a classroom for GED prep, a garden where kids planted flowers to feel alive. By 27, he had helped hundreds, his name in local papers, his face on flyers. A healer they'd never know was forged in abandonment. His life was full but guarded. He lived alone in a modest apartment above the center, a space with bare walls, a single chair, a shelf of books on trauma and resilience. Friends, colleagues mostly, filled the gaps his family had left, but he kept them at arm's length, a habit from years of trusting no one. He never spoke of Daniel, Ruth, or Jacob in interviews, brushing off questions with a tight smile. I focus on the present. To the world, he had no past, no roots, just a mission. But late at night, he'd stand at his window watching snow fall, the forest flashing back, the slap, the mud, the silence. It wasn't pain anymore, but a reminder of why he fought, for the kids who'd been erased like he had been. Hope Haven became his legacy. He started a hotline, staffed round the clock, taking calls himself when shifts ran thin. I'm here, he'd say to a trembling voice on the line. You're not alone. He spoke at conferences, his words raw and real. Rejection doesn't define you, it's what you do next that does. Clips of his talks spread online, millions watching the doctor in the white coat who knew their hurt. Donations poured in, enough to fund a second center, and Noah hired more staff, trained them to see what he saw, potential beneath the wounds. He'd walk the halls, checking on patients, his presence a quiet anchor. You're enough, he'd tell them, meaning it every time. Success didn't erase the echoes. Some nights, he'd sit in his office, a cup of tea gone cold, staring at a photo of Dr. Ellis pinned to the wall, the only father he'd claim. The void still whispered, memories of that truck speeding off, the lie of his death, but he'd turned it into full. At dawn, Noah was a name, a force, a healer who'd risen from nothing. He'd built a family from strangers, a life from ashes, and never looked back. But the past, buried deep, was stirring, a shadow he didn't yet see creeping closer. Noah sat at his desk in Hope Haven, the late afternoon light slanting through the blinds, casting stripes across a stack of patient charts. At 27, he'd carved a life from the ruins, a doctor, a healer, the steady heart of a center that saved kids others threw away. His phone buzzed, an email popping up from an address he didn't recognize. Daniel. Morrow, 1955, his breath caught. 10 years since that name meant anything. 10 years since the forest, the slap, the truck speeding off. He opened it, hands steady but heart pounding. Noah, it's your father. We need to see you. Please. Below, a plea. Daniel had a heart condition, Ruth was a wreck, and Jacob, his brother, was in crisis. Noah's jaw tightened. He deleted it, the words lingering like smoke. Days later, a knock rattled his office door. He opened it to shadows of the past. Daniel, thinner now, his marine frame hunched, a cane trembling in his grip. Ruth, her face lined deep, eyes red from crying, and behind them a social worker from Hope Haven looking uneasy. They asked for you, she said, stepping back. Noah stood rigid, the air thick with a decade's weight. Daniel spoke first, voice raspy. We've hit hard times, son. Ruth clutched her purse, adding, Jacob's in trouble. Drugs, bad ones. He's here at your center. Noah's stomach dropped. His brother, the golden son, a patient under his roof, and they didn't even know it was his. The story unraveled, raw and jagged. 5 years ago, Daniel had sunk their savings into a failing farm equipment business, chasing a dream of wealth that crumbled when the market turned. Bankruptcy followed, their house foreclosed, their pride stripped bare. Ruth had taken to begging at church, her prayers unanswered as Jacob spiraled. Heroin, then fentanyl, a string of arrests landing him in rehab after rehab. Now he was at Hope Haven, admitted days ago, skeletal and strung out, fighting withdrawal in a room Noah had built. "We didn't know it was yours," Daniel admitted, his eyes avoiding Noah's. "We heard it's the best. We need your help." Ruth's voice broke. "He's dying, Noah, and your dad's sick. We've got nothing left." He let them sit, the silence heavy. They laid it bare. Daniel's heart was failing, a surgery looming he couldn't afford. Jacob's treatment costs were piling up. Their insurance gone. They wanted money, expertise, a miracle from him, the son they had erased. "You're a doctor now," Daniel said, a salesman's edge cutting through his desperation. "You can fix this." Ruth reached for his hand, trembling. "We're still family." Noah pulled back, his voice low, sharp. "Family? You left me in the rain, told everyone I was dead. Now you're here because you're broke?" Daniel flinched. Ruth sobbed, but he saw it. No remorse, just need. The twist came when he checked Jacob's file. His brother, once broad and cocky, was now a ghost. 24, gaunt, track marks up his arms, admitted after an overdose. Noah had seen him in the ward, hadn't recognized the hollow face, hadn't known until now. The social worker confirmed it. He's critical. Detox is rough. Daniel and Ruth didn't know Noah ran the place, didn't know he'd built it from nothing. They sat there, begging a stranger who wasn't a stranger, their pride swallowed by desperation. "Please," Daniel rasped, leaning on his cane. "Save him. Save us." Ruth's tears fell harder. "We were wrong. We see that now." Noah's hands clenched. Wrong didn't erase 10 years. He stood, pacing to the window, snow swirling outside. The forest flickered back, the slap, the mud, the lie of his death, but so did Hope Haven. The kids he'd saved, the life he'd made. They weren't here for him. They were here for what he had. He turned, meeting their eyes, his voice steady. "I'll treat Jacob. He's my patient, not your son. But you don't get me back." Daniel's face hardened, Ruth's crumpled, but Noah held firm. They'd come crawling, shadows of the family that buried him, begging for a lifeline he'd forged alone. He wouldn't bend, not for them. Noah stood in the sterile hallway of Hope Haven, his white coat crisp against his frame, watching through a glass window as Jacob lay in a bed, hooked to an IV, his skin pale and stretched tight over bones. At 27, Noah had built this place, a sanctuary for the broken, never imagining his own brother would end up here, a shell of the golden son he'd once envied. 10 years after that forest night, his family had returned, not with love, but with pleas. Daniel, frail with a failing heart, Ruth, shattered by grief, and Jacob, lost to drugs. They'd begged him to save them. And now, facing them again, Noah felt no fire of vengeance, just a quiet resolve to close the wound they'd left. He met them in his office, the air thick with their desperation. Daniel sat hunched, his cane tapping the floor, his voice a rasp. "We're out of options, Noah. Jacob's dying, and I can't pay for surgery." Ruth twisted a tissue, eyes red. "You're our only hope. Please, he's your brother." Noah leaned back, arms crossed, his gaze steady. "You didn't call him my brother when you drove off. You didn't call me your son when you told the world I was dead." Daniel's mouth opened, then shut. Ruth's sobs broke the silence. They didn't deny it. They couldn't. And Noah saw the truth. They weren't sorry, just scared. He didn't shout, didn't curse. The anger that once fueled him had burned out long ago, replaced by something stronger. Purpose. "I'll treat Jacob," he said, voice even. "Not because you asked, but because it's who I am. He stays here, under my care. No chaos, but you don't get me back." Daniel's eyes narrowed, a flicker of the old hardness, but he nodded. Ruth reached out, whispering, "Thank you," her hand trembling. Noah stepped back, untouched. "This isn't forgiveness," he added. "It's me letting go." And they left, heads bowed, their footsteps fading down the hall, carrying nothing of him with them. Days later, Noah stood before a packed room at Hope Haven. Kids and staff gathered for a weekly talk. His voice filled the space, calm but unshakable. "I was left once, thrown out like trash because of who I am. But family isn't the ones who abandon you. It's the ones who stay, who fight for you when you can't. You're that family to me." The room erupted in applause, teens with tear-streaked faces clapping hardest. And Noah felt it, not triumph over his parents, but peace with himself. He'd saved Jacob, watched him stabilize, sent him back to a life Noah wouldn't share. He'd given mercy, not revenge, and it set him free. That night, he sat in his apartment, snow tapping the window, a cup of tea warm in his hands. The forest lingered. The slap, the rain, the lie, but it was distant now, a shadow he'd outgrown. He'd built Hope Haven, healed hundreds, become more than they'd ever dreamed. His family had begged, and he'd answered, not for them, but for the boy they'd left behind. Noah smiled, small and real, knowing he'd won, not by their measure, but his own. Who's lifted you up when others let you down? Tell me below, it's a story worth sharing. If Noah's journey touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Heart Stories. Join us. Let's keep these stories alive together.